Thank you all for being here today on this, well, here in Oklahoma, it is kind of cloudy and rainy. Okay. Okay. Bojo, Jauno and Deshnakas, Mko Ododem, Borewad Mindal, Shishi Beniak and De Bendagwes, Shawnee, Oklahoma, Adaya. I'm Kaya DeerInWater, and I'm, like it says here, I'm citizen Potawatomi, and I live in Shawnee. This picture right here is of me and my family. So what we're going to go over today is the Four Sisters cropping system, or the Four Sisters indigenous gardening technique. And you probably have heard of the Three Sisters before, and a lot of people add a fourth sister in there to round out the crops. So today we're going to go over, like I said, I went over my introduction. We're going to share a story first of all, and then we will go over all of the sisters: corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers, which is the fourth sister. And then I'll do a little introduction to indigenous gardening, and then afterwards hopefully there will be time for questions and comments and discussions. All right, so this story is by Hyde Erdrich, and she is from the Turtle Mountain Band of Ojibwa. So she is from our big sister tribe up there in, I think it's North Dakota and Montana. So, and this beautiful picture comes from Original Local. It's a cookbook by the Erdrich sisters. The earth was built on the back of a turtle. After the flood, as everybody knows, Sky Woman fell to earth just as the birds and the animals had finished the job. When she landed, she gave birth to a daughter. This daughter became a young woman, and one day she was pregnant. Who did this? Sky Woman asked. It was the west wind, her daughter replied. She gave birth to twin boys and died. These boys ran off in order to cause various stories all around the earth. For the moment, you can call them G.I. Howdy and G.I. Joe. Sky Woman told them, "You will have 4 sisters to mind while I'm gone." Sky Woman buried her daughter and sang a sacred song over the dirt. Corn, then squash, and beans grew out of the ground right there. Sky Woman sent these spirits of the garden to find people. They were inside of seeds, carried on the wind and by the birds and animals. Old Magic Woman found them. Old Magic Woman was always digging around. She would look at things and think of what to call them. She decided to invent Native American agriculture. She made a clearing among the cottonwood trees down by the river. She worked the soil with her digging stick. The big buck deer came out of the trees and raked the ground with their horns. Later, the deer came back and raked the weeds. They came back one last time to eat and shed their horns. Old Magic Woman tied the horns onto a stick to make her own garden rake. The people who followed Old Magic Woman did, and they prospered. Old Magic Woman went out to gather firewood. When she came back, she said, "I saw the gooseberry leaves opening up today, so it's time to plant the seeds that Raven has brought to us." She made a hill of dirt and buried the seeds. She gave them plenty of water. Along came the older sister, Corn. At first, she was like a small shoot of grass. The girls and the woman and the birds sang to corn to make it all grow tall and strong and straight. They sing my praises, thought corn. The sky is the limit, so I shall not quit. Even when corn had grown quite high and sturdy, the girls and women kept watch over her and chased away the birds and the animals and the boys who might be hungry. When the geese come back, it will be time to plant corn again, they sang. When the boys come to smile at us, we will send them away. Corn thought, I am the single most important plant in North America. This is true. Everything in America will eventually be, and the whole planet will eventually be involving corn. For those who need independent verification, simply Google the importance of corn. Um, Without quotation marks, there was at least 1 million internet entries. However, if you insist on typing corn is number one with quotations, you will find one entry in which corn is implicated in the case of a dog and discussed on a veterinary forum. Meanwhile, Corn looked down and saw something interesting. A tubular thing came out of the ground, unfolding its green wings, but instead of flying away, it sent out a long green feeler and started to climb Corn. What are you doing? You're going to strangle me. Get off. Can't you stand on your own? Cried Corn. No, said the bean. This is what I do. It continued to make its way up by wrapping itself around corn, hugging onto corn, and furthermore, it is for your own good that you support me. I can do lots of good tricks. I can take the air and turn it into nitrogen for your roots. I can turn you into a complete protein. I can make you famous. There will be a song called Beans and Cornbread on TV. Yeah, you need me. I have more surprises after this, said Bean. Corn was not a hugger, but that was the situation. Along came Squash. Two blunt, shiny green sprouts split more and more into leaves, and the leaves grew huge and floppy on long, prickly vines. Squash spread out over like a blanket or shawl around corn and beans. Broad and humble, ground hugging and patient, low lying was the squash. Is that all you do? Asked the bean. The squash said, Look, I have both male and female blossoms, and two gigantic yellow flowers burst open, shocking the corn and beans. They shut up. And my leaves will keep your ground moist and shady and weed free, so your roots will not dry up in the heat of the sun, while my itchy vines will discourage the hungry animals and the big colorful fruits underneath these leaves, too. The spirit of corn, being creative and adventurous risk taker, began to feel stifled with all this arrangements. Always under wraps. Corn wandered off in the cool of night, wanting to find and collect the dews which came to earth on moonbeams. Corn thought, I am sure that I have magic powers to attract the night mist and fog that drip from my leaves in the morning, which my sisters are always drinking, although it is I who make this all happen. As soon as Corn left, a being known as Cheob came and blighted the garden. The spirits of bean and squash were crushed beneath the dark, moldy disposition. Cheob went after Corn and took her captive in his abode deep beneath the surface of earth. Corn wept. She wept and sang her germinal song to feel her way out of this mess. A little animal was listening to the gentle breeze which picked up the lament from the hole in the ground. The little animal did not immediately comprehend the corn language, but being moved by this strange silky voice, formulated a response using the highly evolved, complex, sophisticated yet divinely designed vocabulary of a prairie dog. This alarmed Sun and thus alarmed, Sun sent a messenger in search of the corn spirit because of that germinating tune that lingered in the air. The messenger called Corn, shining a light into the black tunnel of Chijiob, led her back to the garden where her sisters were dying of thirst. Corn made a promise to Sun that she would never leave again until harvest time was over and all the seeds were safely stored away. The sun stationed its messenger to keep watch over the garden from that day forward. Who are you, and why are you beaming us like that? Asked Corn, Squash, and Bean when they saw the stranger. I am your new sister, the sunflower, and it is my job to project a positive mental attitude. I will stand to the north side of the garden and thus encourage all living things in this beautiful, scientifically sound ecosystem, which is our joint accomplishment. The pressure was off because Sunflower could stand with Corn, which would then take the heat off Bean and Squash, who could just go on doing their things. Then the Sunflower called forth the little animal whose voice she had heard, and gave her a beautiful green shawl with corn silk tassels, intertwined designs of leaves and vines, flowers that was spontaneously generated from that song, which got all messed up in translation, but went something like this. Manadumans, little spirit seeds, I am but one in the design of the scroll of the sprawling vine, flowering tendril of the scarlet runner, a dark red spark I glimpse like hope, like the sweet wild strawberry daemon on the spear of light in the shade of a forest that signified our origins. O day, the poor heart of the human being, send us the light, the little spirit seeds in your hands, dear, holy, curvilinear path forward through time, all time and trespass, 5 fingers of the hawthorn leaf, like a hand hold this crown of mysteries. Lead us from all darkness, bead by bead by bead, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, as it is manifest in the greenery of this vinery, this leafery. The fingers work in your own language. I believe in the creator of heaven and earth, and I believe each and every deed is a bead, is a seed, is a need in every one of us, unfurling the vine, still growing. All right. So, oops, I forgot to advance the slides. I'm sorry. So these are some pictures of that were supposed to go along with the story. That's a picture of corn, of course, some corn I grew a few years back. There's some more beans and squash, of course. There's the little prairie dog. And lastly, sunflower. Okay, so what I wanted to talk about with madamen or corn was the different varieties of corn, kind of the basics of how you grow corn, and then what you can do with the corn once you have it. So this corn that you see here in the picture is corn that we're growing in the community garden this year. And it is a Flint corn. And a Flint corn is one of the most widely used varieties because it is kind of a shorter day variety. Corn takes around 100 days to mature. And this Flint corn is, as you can see, a tall variety, and it usually only has 1 or maybe 2 ears in it. But there are other varieties of corn, and it's all started with teosinte, a wild grass in central Mexico. And so the very oldest corn is the pod corn, and that still has husks on it, and that's the bottom, the bottommost cob on the picture of road corn here. And it is still grown in indigenous gardening, and it's kind of grown on the outer margins of the garden to mix some genetic diversity in with your seeds. And I know the Haudenosaunee folks in New York still do this. There are indigenous folks in Mexico who are doing it, and then some of the Pueblos in the Southwest are doing it, growing it on the edge of their the margins of their garden to introduce genetic diversity into their crops. Then right after the evolution of Podcorn, the next step would be the popcorn, and it's got the smallest little kernels, and they are more flinty than floury. Like if you break them open, it's kind of a really hard small kernel. After that came flint corn, and flint corn in the evolution of corn, flint corn is the seeds are larger and more more powdery than popcorn or podcorn, but they are not quite as far developed as flour corn. And flour corn, the seeds are really large and flat. And if you break them open, it's just like full of powder. There's a little tiny shell, but that's it. And then you have sweet corn and dent corn as the last two. You'll know you have a dent corn because on the end of the seed, there's a little dent in it, a little dimple in it. And that's a lot of people around here grow dent corn, and it's animal feed. It's one of the most widely used varieties of corn for animal feed. And then lastly, you have your sweet corn, which is the youngest evolutionary step in corn. And there's not that many varieties of indigenous varieties of sweet corn, because most of the corn that was grown and eaten was used for a winter food source, not a summer food source. And you can also eat any of these other varieties in the green corn stage when it's immature, and it will have a milky sweet flavor to it. And there is a lot of tribes have green corn ceremonies where they harvest, some of the young corn in the midsummer, like probably around now. But so those are the 6 varieties of corn. And then within those 6 varieties, there is thousands of individual types or individual varieties of each one of those types of corn. So, and we, as Potawatomi folks, we have a number of varieties in the popcorn, the flint corn, and I'm not sure about all of the other corns. That a lot was taken from us in colonization. Some of our brothers and sisters up north still have a lot of different varieties. There are a lot of Ojibwa varieties. There are a few Odawa varieties. If you look in the museums, you can find pictures and mentions of all of the Potawatomi corn from the homelands. But most of this corn, like I said, was used for a winter food source through the process of nixtamalization, which is using a lying agent, either wood ash or lye, to kind of break apart the outer hull and access the protein. And then it would be dried and stored in caches for winter use. And there's also, you could do a parching process with sweet corn and then dry it. And the Cope's corn soup that you can get at the Fry Bread taco stand in Shawnee is made from dried parched sweet corn. And that was also an indigenous technique. It just wasn't quite as widely used as the other varieties of corn because it has way lower protein content and way higher sugar content. So it's kind of like a treat. You know, it's a delicacy, if you will. But that's a little bit about corn, the corn varieties. And every tribe has their own variety. One thing I definitely wanted to mention is you can really only grow one variety of corn at a time, unless you do a specific planting technique, either separating it by a mile or separating it by a month. Here in Oklahoma, we have a long enough growing season where we could technically grow 3 different crops of corn spaced out from the last frost until July and have that all work out if you're willing to pollinate, or not pollinate, if you're willing to water your garden heavily during the dry summer. You can technically grow 3 different crops, but you have to wait a month in between growing them. Otherwise they will hybridize, and then you will end up with something that is not what you wanted and sometimes is not edible. And so growing corn is a pretty a labor intensive task. And it's kind of like you're not, a lot of plants that you grow or that I grow, you put the seed in the ground, you water it a few times, you give it some nice soil, and it'll do its thing by itself. Corn is not really like that. Corn, it benefits from a very close-knit relationship with you. You have to constantly be watching your corn, be weeding your corn rows, be making sure the water's right, the wind's right, the all it is a very needy plant. And but just like the word in our language, madaman, it is a miraculous plant. It does provide food, copious amounts of food in a very small amount of time. So it is very, very highly regarded among not only Potawatomi folks, but pretty much all indigenous folks in North America. So there's only a few places in, say, in California and up into the Pacific Northwest where corn was not, did not ever, the growing of corn didn't take place on a regular basis prior to contact. All right, Kojasuk beans. These are and there are 4 varieties of beans: lima beans, pole beans, scarlet runner beans, and then those little gray ones on the bottom left are what we call rabbit beans, but they are a variety of black-eyed peas, or cow peas, they're called sometimes. And these, the 4 varieties that you see here, the pictures, are all grown by Potawatomi folks. The top left picture, the red speckled lima beans, those are those are one of our varieties of beans, and they can be used as a dry bean or grown and eaten as like a green lima bean, like a young tender lima bean. And they are very prolific in the right spot with the right amount of attention. You can get, from one plant, you could probably get a whole 4 or 5 cups of dry beans, which is pretty prolific. Then the second one over is those are our Potawatomi pole beans. Some people call them Miami pole beans or Ohio pole beans, and honestly, they could be either Miami pole beans or Potawatomi pole beans. We shared a very similar territory with the Miami, and northern Indiana and southern Michigan, kind of western Ohio area is all it isn't, the territories aren't as cut and dry as state lines are today. Our villages intermixed a lot. So you'd have, on the same river course, you'd have Potawatomi villages right next to Miami villages, or Miami villages right next to Potawatomi villages. So there was lots of trading and intermixing between all of that. And those pole beans are the Potawatomi pole beans right there, the purple ones, are really used. They're not a dual purpose bean like a lot of other beans. They're more of a dry bean. So you'd grow them and then you'd wait for them to dry on the pod until the end of the harvest time, probably October or November, depending on where you are. Here in Oklahoma, we have kind of an interesting situation where it's so humid and hot a lot of the time and it rains a lot in the kind of the end of the season, that you can't leave your beans to dry like you would in other parts of the country. You have to pull them off and harvest them when they're when they're starting to dry out, but not completely dry. And if anybody wants for me to go into that more with them, I'm happy to discuss it in an email or over the phone. Next, we have our Bearpaw beans, or our Scarlet runner beans, and those are they are a very large, meaty bean. They're a great soup bean, and they are actually a perennial vine. So they're a kind of more tropical vine originally. And if you live in a very mild climate, like say Florida or southern Texas or maybe Southern California, you might be able to get away with growing these and having them be like a year-round vine. But they have beautiful red flowers. And like I said, the bean itself is really meaty and large, great soup bean. And the vine is really, really tall. This Scarlet runner bean would not be a good bean to put in a integrated Three Sisters garden, kind of where you growing everything right next to each other, like the corn, beans, and squash all go into the same spot. You wouldn't want to do that because the 12-foot tall vines would overtake your corn and knock it down. And that's happened before. Even with the lima beans, that can happen, where the lima beans will grow so vigorously, and so they get so much weight to them because they're so large that it pulls down the corn. And that's why there's certain beans that their name is cornhill beans, and those beans are good because for growing in that kind of situation where you're growing all of the Three Sisters or Four Sisters together, it's good because they produce a lot of food, but they're also not so vigorous and so lush that the weight of the vine pulls the corn down. You also have to pair the right corn with the right bean. So there's a little bit of trial and error technique if you're new to gardening with the Four Sisters. It can take a few years. I say give it 3 years, and if by the third year you're still struggling, then look for someone to help with that process. But lastly, we have the fourth bean in the picture, which is the bottom left, and that's our rabbit bean. And the rabbit bean is, like I said, it's a cowpea or a black-eyed pea variety. And there's a lot of different names for that rabbit bean. There's two varieties that I know of that are grown by Potawatomi folks, and this one is the gray rabbit bean. And there's also a variety that's like the red rabbit bean. And these ones are really prolific. Like they're the easiest, in my opinion, to grow here in Oklahoma. They kind of grow themselves. Like we grew them a few years, and we haven't intentionally grown them in the community garden in the last couple years, but they still pop up and grow themselves. So, but they are, as a bean, you do have to soak them and soak them a really long time, because they have a really kind of harder outer shell, and they're not as tender as some of the other beans that are pictured here. And growing beans, all of these varieties are pole varieties. You need to put them on some kind of support, whether it's a piece of bamboo, or you string up a trellis with twine, or anything of that sort. But yeah, these varieties, you have to grow them on something, otherwise they won't do well. Okay, so we have Questman next. Squash, or pumpkins. Squash and pumpkins are kind of the same thing in my mind. Botanically speaking, they're the same thing. And so the very first, there are 4 types of squash. There are your regular pumpkins, your Cucurbita pepo. Then the next one, the top right picture, is Cucurbita argyrosperma, and that's green striped cushaw, or I think some people call it green striped Potawatomi squash. Long neck pumpkin, it's also called, but it has a lot of different names. And then you have on the bottom right, you have a butternut variety called Cucurbita moscuta, and that is there's also like Seminole squash, Muskogee pumpkin, Lakota squash. There are a lot of different varieties, but butternut squash are in that family. The picture with the 2 pumpkins leaning against each other and the wave in the background. And lastly, you have Cucurbita maxima, and that picture is of our Gete Questman, our old squash. That there's the story of the 800-year-old squash, and that some archaeologists found it in a pot on the Menominee Reservation. I think that story has been debunked, and as much as it is spread around, it's not actually true. The variety was maintained by some Menominee, I believe it's Menominee women up in Wisconsin. But it is nonetheless a Great Lakes variety of squash, and it is a very large banana-shaped squash. And this Cucurbita maxima has a lot of other varieties of winter squash or pumpkins in it. There's like down here in Oklahoma, the Cherokee have the North Georgia candy roaster. There's also sweet potato squash, which are all in the same variety. So growing squash, you here in Oklahoma and much of the eastern half of North America, you really have to be careful for 2 pests, and those are squash vine borers, which are the larva of a moth, and they get little caterpillar grows inside the vine. And then the second one is the pesky squash bug. And those 2 pests are by far the most, cause the most trouble and damage and crop loss here in the eastern half of North America. But growing squash is otherwise fairly easy. I typically just mound up a little hill 2 or 3 inches high, plant a few seeds a couple feet apart, a foot, plant 3 seeds a foot apart, and then you can wait for the leaves to pop up. Squash is a pretty heavy feeder, so it's really important all these crops are really heavy feeders. Even beans, you think about beans being the nitrogen fixers, and you hear the story of how it all supports each other. But at least here in Oklahoma, it still requires a good amount of fertilizer. And I think our ancestors knew that, with all the stories of fish being buried in the bottom of each hill of the garden. So that's a little about squash. And lastly, we have Suteagen, or sunflower. And the left picture here is, of course, of the sunflower itself, the flower, where you get the little seeds like that, you eat at a baseball game or something like that. And then the right picture is a lesser known sunflower, but still really important sunflower. And it's called Sunchoke, or Neshnabe Panique, or that's like Indian potato. And it's a perennial. So the difference between a perennial and an annual is an annual grows, flowers, seeds, and dies in 1 year. A perennial grows many years over and over again in the same spot. So sunchokes are a perennial sunflower, and they also have beautiful sunflowers, yellow ray-like sunflowers. And both of these are native to North America and can be grown in a Four Sisters garden. I would caution you, when you're growing sunchokes, make sure that if you put them in your garden, that you put them somewhere where you don't mind always having sunchokes, because they are kind of like potatoes in that if you leave one little tiny seed potato in your garden, you're going to have potato pop up there, and it's really hard to get rid of. So they're a great food source. They're really great for carbohydrate for diabetic folks, because they have I think they have really high inulin or really low inulin. I can't remember. I always get that mixed up. Okay, so this is some garden beds from, low battery. This is some garden beds from Michigan, and this is how our ancestors would have situated their gardens. You have like the cross-hatching technique, where the rows are alternating northwest and east, north, south, and east, west. And then you have like a medicine wheel garden in the middle, where it's it's shaped like kind of like a sunflower, in fact. And then you have another one on the right here, where it's kind of an interesting geometric shape. And not only is it what you're growing in an indigenous garden, but where you're growing. How you situate your garden in the landscape is important too. Our ancestors typically would have picked fertile valleys, river bottoms. Here in Oklahoma, you see a lot of agriculture on river bottoms and not a lot of agriculture anywhere else. And that is because it's the most fertile soil. And when the rivers flood, they deposit silt and nutrients every single year, multiple times a year sometimes. And so the fertility is really high in those situations where other parts of the landscape, on hills, on the tops of mountains, in other parts, it's not so fertile, and you'd have to really work harder, and it'd dry out, and the water would cause erosion and all kinds of things. So yes, just that thinking about where you're situating your garden is important. Not only that, but you want to be able to, if you're growing a garden, of course, you need lots of sun. Some crops need more sun, some crops need less, but these Three Sisters gardens need a very minimum of 6 hours of sun. Okay, so why is it called the Three Sisters Garden? And it is called the Three Sisters because every single crop or every single sister provides something else to the system as a whole to complete the growing cycle, and to be most efficient in using resources, and using light, and using space. Not only does it grow well together, but also when you harvest them, a Three Sisters or Four Sisters garden will be nutritionally more complete than if you're growing other gardens, because the corn is a protein source, a carbohydrate source, especially if you grow a flint, a dent, or a flour, where you're drying the corn and then processing it using nixtamalization. You get extra boost of protein doing it that way. And then, the beans are more proteins, more vitamin, more carbohydrates. The squash is extra carbohydrates and vitamins, really important, vitamin A, vitamin C, antioxidants. And lastly, the sunflower. The sunflower, in a Four Sisters nutrition kind of system, the sunflower provides really important fats that aren't really plentiful otherwise. It's a pretty lean, nutritionally, it's pretty lean diet on fat, in the fat portion of it. So it's important. The Fourth Sister is important in that regard, because fat is needed for your digestion. It's needed for your brain. It's having healthy fats in your diet is important. So like I was saying, not only is it important, the Four Sisters cropping is important for growing a garden, but it provides a good source of nutrition, and everything works together to complement each other in this regard. Okay, so if you want to actually grow a garden, a Three Sisters garden, there's kind of two basic techniques. One of them is kind of the segregated technique, where you're growing, like this diagram shows, you're growing everything kind of separate. And then there is the integrated type, where you're growing everything in one hill. You would grow, let's see, do I have, oh, nope. So in the integrated garden type, you would grow, you'd have 5 or 6 corn plants, 3 or 4 beans, and then squash on the outside of the hill. And that would be it for your hill. The problem that I have with growing in that manner, is it's really difficult to maintain if in a garden setting. To get in and to weed, you have to lift up the squash vines that are growing all over the place. You have to make sure that there aren't weeds growing in between and on top of your mounds. And so that, in my mind, that integrated system is kind of used in a situation where you're planting, you're cultivating, but then you kind of just walk away and let it do its thing until it's harvest time. Whereas the segregated garden, where you're growing each crop individually in rows, is easier to maintain in a garden setting. You can go in and weed or hoe or mow or whatever technique you're using with ease. Oh geez, it's the top of the hour, so yeah, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I can hopefully answer some questions. I'm sure there are questions. So let's see. Does anybody have any questions for me? I see 21 people finally made it on. That's good. That's a lot higher than I expected, given the difficulties we had with Zoom this morning. So if you have a question, you can show the last slide so that we can review the. Oh yes, yeah. Let me share my screen again. Yeah, and I can send. We can send a copy of a PDF of the presentation to you if you are interested. Maybe put your email in the bottom in the chat if you want a copy of the presentation sent to you. Okay.
For fertilizer?
Yes. Hello? Sorry, I missed part of that.
Oh, sorry. What would you recommend for fertilizer throughout the growing season?
Okay. So I use, I am of the opinion that organic fertilizers are better than synthetic chemical fertilizers, but some people are not that way. So I use a couple different varieties of kind of, it's called like tomato fertilizer or vegetable fertilizer, and it's pelleted and or granulated, and it's by a company called Whitney Farms, and it provides about 2 months of nutrition for the plants. You kind of just work it into the soil, in the top of the soil, and then you can water it in, and it kind of breaks down. It's a slow release, more or less. There's also Down to Earth, makes a vegetable or tomato fertilizer. Anything with kind of a low NPK, so like a 3 or a 4 on the NPK scale will be good. Let's see, there's another one, Espoma, I think they make anything that's OMRI tested, that's Organic Research Methods Institute. Anything that's OMRI tested is generally good, in my opinion. But the Whitney Farm stuff is, I've had amazing success over the last couple years with that. And then you can also, use fish emulsion. You can mix your own, let's see, to start out pots in the greenhouse with some of the plants, like the squash. I use blood meal, bone meal, and potash. So just a little scoop in my potting mix. That's a scoop of blood meal, a scoop of bone meal, and a scoop of potash. And that does about the same 6 or 8 weeks of nutrition for the plants. And here in Oklahoma, we have such a long growing season that it really is like 2 or 3 applications to get through the whole season. And especially if you're doing a fall garden, you'd want to provide nutrition for that period for the winter garden as well.
I was also wondering about timing on putting these things outside. Like if you wanted to just start everything outside, like how far apart do you need to plant your corn versus your beans versus your squash?
Great question. Yeah, sorry I didn't go through that portion of the presentation. If you're growing an integrated system, meaning you're growing everything in one hill, then you want to wait. Generally, it's a week to 2 weeks between planting the corn until you're planting the beans and the squash. So, or about when the corn is about a foot, 6 inches to a foot tall, because you want the corn to have enough head start to be able to keep up with the beans, because once the beans start growing, they're real fast. Again, it's important what variety of bean you're growing. Not all beans can be grown in that way because they will take down corn. And so you want a cornhill bean, or just a bean that you know is going to be not too vigorous for the variety of corn you're growing. There are corn varieties that you could grow, like I think Hickory King is one of them, that it reaches like 12 or 14 feet of height at maturity. That might be a good one to grow with any old bean, because it doesn't matter how big the vine gets, the corn will still outgrow it. But I'd say a week or two. If you're growing in the segregated system, you can grow them all at the same time, because they have enough space and they have enough room to be grown at the same time. But generally, you can't grow corn until the last frost has passed. So here in Oklahoma, that's mid to late April, but you should check with your local ag extension, or even online, just check your last frost date. And you don't want to put any corn in before that last frost date. It's sometime in the spring, depending on where you are. Probably from March to May, I would guess. All right. Any more questions?
Would it be possible where if we wanted to grow, Potawatomi varieties of
Yeah.
these plants, how would we go about getting a hold of some of the seeds?
Where are you located?
We're currently in St. Louis, Missouri.
Okay. So the issue I've come to terms with is that Potawatomi varieties are adapted to the upper Midwest. And so their cycles, their day length cycles, their flowering cycles, all of that are really kind of keyed into that. And so all the 3 previous years I've grown in the community garden, I've tried Potawatomi varieties, but they haven't done well down here in Oklahoma. So you might start St. Louis. I'm not sure. Your guys are like kind of halfway between the Great Lakes and where we are. You could maybe get away with it, but I would say look to a locally adapted variety over a heritage variety. Unfortunately, I think that our heritage varieties are really only adapted to that individual spot in the Great Lakes. But if you were to, I actually don't have any seeds left. Otherwise, I would say you could, I could give some to you. You might put it out there on Facebook, and people would share. There are some seed companies who might sell you varieties. You could look on nativeseedsearch.org. That's another, it's a nonprofit seed organization for Native American seeds. And then you could also go to a seed swap. If you know of those, you could find one that is around. There's usually seed swaps in every region during, well, sometimes they're during the like late winter, like March or February, around February time. Sometimes they're in the spring, right before the growing season starts. If you want to message, or if you want to email me, I can put all of that in an email for you. And I should add my email to the chat box. All right. Is there any more questions from anybody? I really like those questions, Emily. Thank you.
This was so informative, Kaya. You answered all the questions I could think of. This is great.
All right. And oops, if you have any questions pop up in your mind later on, my email's there. Please don't hesitate. Please don't hesitate to reach out. All righty, Pamapi, everyone.